Well, I would give that advice in a way that contrasts my generation from their generation. So when you think about what we as PR people knew going into our careers, in my case, 40 years ago, actually, I was a journalist before I was in PR. But in many respects, it was the same thing, which was know how to write well. I mean, it's the first thing. And no matter how much technology you have mastered, no matter how much social media you have mastered, it all comes back to good, clean, simple, clear writing. I don't know how else to put it. Now, what has changed about writing? Writing is briefer than it was. It has to be brief. But that just puts more emphasis on clarity and being able to write well. So the first thing I would say to students is probably the same thing that their older professors have told them, which is know how to write simply and clearly. Master the book on Writing Well by William Zinsser, which is a classic book. Yeah, 22nd, I think it's in its 23rd edition. Use that as the Bible, right? Avoid jargon, write like you talk, which is something I say all the time. I say, good writing is edited conversation. It should sound like you, but above all, it needs to be simple and clear. So that's the first piece of advice. Now, having said that, I would say that your generation is so much different than mine in the sense that you have to master this enormous number of tools that we didn't have, right? When you think back about, media relations, for example, you wrote press releases, you followed those press releases up with phone calls, you had press conferences, and that was about it. Those were your tools. Now, I'm leaving out things like expertise in crisis communications and investor relations. But if you were a starting PR person back in my day, those are the things that you would have. Well, imagine what you have now, right? You have to be a good video editor. You have to look good on camera, or at least practice your camera technique. You have to be a great writer. You have to know social media. You have to know social media analytics. You have to be, part mathematician, part English major, part videographer. And I always say, at least at Ragan Communications, I always say that the more of those things you know, the more marketable you're going to be, at least in the beginning, right? Now, as you ascend the ladder in PR and corporate communications, then all sorts of other things will be required as well. A real good grasp of strategy and all of those more complex things that you gain with experience. But in the beginning, when I come across a young student or a graduate that has mastered all of those tools, those are the people I'm looking for. One of the ways I deal with that is by telling them that one of the pioneering fields in PR and in marketing is what I call brand journalism. Now, at Ragan Communications, brand journalism has exploded in terms of our clientele. Right now, we probably have 5 major clients that are launching news sites under their brand. Now, this has been going on for 8 to 10 years now, and we've been at the forefront at Ragan teaching companies how to be media outlets. And really, I want to repeat that. Every company should be its own media outlet. Now, the difference between the way most PR people would hear that and the way I mean it is PR people would say, well, we already are a media outlet. We have a website, we have a YouTube channel. Yes, but you're not practicing brand journalism the way I'm talking about. Press releases is not brand journalism. Sending out video promotions is not brand journalism. What brand journalism is you as the PR and marketing person practicing journalism under your company's banner. So what does that mean? That means if you're a hospital, you're churning through stories constantly every day, just the way a healthcare website would be. You're writing stories on disease. You're writing stories on breakthroughs in medicine. And you are sending those stories out to all of your patients and to your customers or your would-be customers. So when you look at a good brand journalism story, which by the way is put out by PR people, not journalists, PR people. When you're writing brand journalism, if I'm reading it, it should look indistinguishable from the New York Times or from any, choose your media outlet, your mainstream media outlet. It should not look like PR. It should not be forcing messages down people's throats. What brand journalism says is understand your audience and give them what they need in terms of rich content. So for example, one of our proudest brand journalism sites is called blueskypit.com. This is the first ever airport brand journalism site. It's run by the Pittsburgh Airport, and it covers aviation. It covers aviation issues as they relate to the city of Pittsburgh and to the Pittsburgh Airport. And when I say covers, I truly mean covers. I mean, we break stories at the Pittsburgh Airport that the media chases. And that's the sign of a good PR brand journalism department. So when one of, I can't remember if it was Trump or a vice president visited the airport right after we launched, we had a whole team of content producers out there doing stories about how they were protecting the president. We had interviewing the Secret Service, doing video stories. So when I say brand journalism, as it relates to the PR field, I really mean journalism. It's just journalism thought differently. We've had clients that syndicated. Remember, these are PR departments. One of our first clients was Cape Cod Health, and they actually syndicated their content because it was so good that the local radio station, local television station said, hey, we want that. We want to use that. And of course, brand journalism to us at Ragan Consulting was an enormous breakthrough for us as a business because it made so much sense. You know, why, as my colleague and head of Ragan Consulting says, don't pitch the media a story. Write the story and pitch it. This is why writing and content producing is so important. You want to write stories that grab people with the first paragraph. You want to write briefly. You want to have human interest stories because we all know that people want to read about other people, right? So right. All of those things that we associate with journalism is now really what you should be associating with PR. And if we have a crisis, if one of our clients has a crisis, our advice is attack it just the way a journalist would. You know, don't try to hide it. Don't try to play it down because that never works either. So go right after that story the way a journalist would. Now, that doesn't mean, I want to be realistic here. That doesn't mean you're going to launch an investigation into your CEO. But what it does mean is if you represent a nuclear power plant and there are protesters out there on a picket line, you've got to go out there and interview the protesters. You've got to do the story. You've got to be transparent. And what happens is you start to build this email database of people that subscribe to your newsletter, if it's a newsletter. We always say you should have a newsletter that goes with your news site that people can opt into. And one of our first clients was Advocate Healthcare in Chicago. At the time, they had about 8 hospitals. And they launched something called, actually, it was our very first client years ago. They called something called Healthy News. And I don't know, the last time I checked, they had well over 100,000 opt-in subscribers. It may be multiples of that today. And they've been running that for, I think we launched that maybe 10 years ago. Your viewers could go out and type in www.health with small e, healthynews.com, and you would see the Advocate Healthcare site. You have a whole team of PR people that produce it, and you could look at that site and you would not know that was not a health news site. With sponsored content, you're writing the story perhaps the same way, but you're placing it. this is where your company is actually publishing this. So if you're IBM, you are publishing this news site under your banner. Or if you're American Express, American Express had one of the first brand journalism sites. It was called Open Forum. And what it was a news service for small businesses. And it was a beautiful thing to behold. And but there are so many out there right now. And one of our clients is Denver Water, a utility here in Denver. And we would do stories. We would have them do stories where in the springtime, they would march up a mountain and show how they were able to predict how much water the city would have in its reservoirs. We followed this 6-foot Swede up this mountain with one of these big pipes that he would thrust into the snowbanks so that he could measure and I mean, if you're a Denver citizen, you think, oh, that's how they do that. Right. I had no idea. So you could call it brand journalism. In that case, you could call it service journalism. There's all sorts of names for it, but what it isn't is propaganda. Yeah, I'll give you a little short history. So my father, after the war, was casting about to, figure out what am I going to do? How am I going to support myself? My father on the GI Bill went to the University of Chicago and became a English major, really. Then he went to teach at DePaul University. And about that time, this thing we call a newsletter came on the scene. People forget that newsletters really only go back to the 50s and 60s. And this whole idea was that we could do this printed newsletter and keep people in the same industry in touch with one another. So think of the newsletter for those kids who have no idea what I'm talking about. Think of the newsletter as a way to build a network of people who do the same thing, while at the same time giving them tips, tactics, and strategies on how to do better. I mean, the newsletter was essentially a trade association in print, right? Well, my father had this idea in 1967 to launch the first ever newsletter for communicators, internal communicators, not PR people, internal communicators, because that's what he was. He was an internal communicator at the Ford Motor Company. And what did that mean back then? It meant that he edited the employee newsletter, which used to be called, by the way, I love asking audiences this. Do you know the house organ? The most bizarre term. I mean, who came up with that? The house organ. And that's what the employee newsletter was called. Well, my father knew that there were thousands of people in the world that were putting these newsletters out. So he launched something in 1968 called the Ragan Report. And the subtitle was Ideas and Methods for Communication Executives. And with that launch, it was weekly, came out every Monday. And with that launch, my father instantly became really the only guru in internal communications. Now, plenty of gurus in PR, but nobody had been a guru in internal comms. Nobody ever paid attention to internal comms, right? Internal comms consisted of shut up and work. That was internal comms, there's your desk, stop complaining. Well, internal comms then, as the years progressed, became enormously important, as it is today. How would we have gotten through the pandemic if we had not had an amazing internal comms team, right? And of course, Reagan, all these years later, is still the leader in internal comms training, internal comms newsletters, and that kind of thing. So he launched that. He often told the story. He had a little Royal typewriter he used, one of those old clanging typewriters. And he had a list of about 500 people, a Rolodex. And you kept it next to your phone. So he sat there with his Royal typewriter and wrote 500 promotional letters, each one personalized. Well, let me tell you something. This was the launch, right, of the company. And today, the response rate on something like that would be somewhere around 0.5%. Okay, 0.5%. He had an 80% response rate. So the checks started rolling in and he was off and running. And of course, that was the newsletter business, right? It was intensely informative, but there was no advertising. So
Right.
it had to stand on its own. And people kind of realized that. They knew that there was no advertising to support this. It's the exact opposite of today. And so I think at the time, even 30 years ago, it was $395, $400. And of course, that launched Ragan with that one newsletter. And before you know it, he had about 8 employees, including my aunt, who just retired 2 years ago. And then he slowly took more people on. In the meantime, I went off and got my journalism job. I worked at the Williston Herald in North Dakota. That was my first place that I worked at. And then I rose to finally covering Congress and the White House for Copley News Service, New York, the New York Newsday, and a couple of other newspapers. So I made my route in journalism. And then about, I'd say 15 years into my career, just about the time I was thinking about what am I going to do next, my father was diagnosed with ALS, and he had about 2 years, really, because typical ALS patients, terminal disease. And he said, do you want to take over the business? And I said, yeah, I think so. So I came back in 1993, worked with him for 2 years, and we really started growing the company. That's when the company took off. And we got into PR, and then we did investor relations newsletters, and we did media relations. Our stable of conferences went from our one conference, which was the Speechwriters Conference, which, by the way, first ever company to do speechwriters. My father loved it. And so all the way to, I think, pre-pandemic, we had 60 events, 60. So we went from that one event, the Speechwriters Conference, all the way to pre-pandemic 50 to 60 events a year. Now, many of those are workshops back in those days where you'd get one instructor who would travel around the country teaching writing and editing or photography or social media or measurement. And now I'd say this coming year, we'll probably do maybe 12 to 15 conferences. And I'm not sure about workshops. Workshops kind of fell off, but our conferences remain a huge mainstay of Ragan. I miss conferences, and our first one is in Disney,
Right.
at Disney Orlando in September. It's our most popular event. It's the social media conference. I think we already have 30 or 40 people sign up. So there's a lot of people that want to get out there. They're tired of being shut-ins. And then we'll just have our full retinue of conferences. We'll go back to what we used to do, which is we had PR conferences, social media conferences, writing and editing conferences, crisis communications, media relations. All of those will be back in the stable in 2022. One of the biggest breakthroughs for my company, which has really sent us off into a wonderful direction, is about 4 years ago, our conference director, Yolanda Maggi, at the time, said, Ragan's brand is known by absolutely everyone, and why don't we launch a membership organization? So we launched what we call the Communication Leadership Council. That just took off, and it really, probably the most successful thing we've ever done. And we have about 140 Fortune 500 companies, all of the big names, from Amazon to Facebook to almost every insurance company, from Aflac to Progressive, just tons of great companies that are part of this. They pay $20,000 a year to be part of the council. And that gets them a lot of different benefits. It gets their staff access to our events. They have biweekly phone calls with one another in which they talk about everything from how do we communicate in the wake of the George Floyd murder, all the way to diversity issues, everything, every 2 weeks, they all get together on a phone call. And then we do 2 big retreats a year. So our post-pandemic retreat's coming up in October. And that's where they all fly in for 2 days of very intense discussions around what's working and what isn't working in corporate communications. So social media, so I would say membership organizations, conference division, we're still publishing 2 websites. You know us by PR Daily, and then Ragan.com. And then we have the consulting division, which my friend Jim Weissel and I launched 6 or 7 years ago. And so all those things bring us to where we are today. But it all started with my father. He was a writer and a professor. He was a great writer, an amazing writer. And it comes back to what we first said. Writing is everything in this. If you're a good writer, you're going to go places. How can you be in PR and not follow events? You should be a news junkie. If you're a young student coming out of school and I ask you, hey, what do you think? How do you think Biden's infrastructure plan is going? And if you say, well, I'm not going to hire you. You've got to be on top of the news all of the time. And not just news in this country, news all over the world, because you never know when it's going to impact you. Can you imagine being interviewed by the CEO of a Fortune 500 company to be director of internal comms and having no idea where we are right now as a nation with Black Lives Matter or the George Floyd murder? And I'm talking about the nuances of that stuff. You know, one of the wonderful people to come out of the post-Trump presidency is Jen Psaki, who is the White House communications, runs the White House newsroom, the press office. You are constantly in awe of her command of facts. Yep. And how articulate. Can you imagine going up to the podium? If your great aspiration is to one day be the White House press secretary, you have to have such deep knowledge of every single thing that is happening in this world. So, and I bet there's a lot of kids out there today listening and thinking, boy, I'd like to be Jen Psaki, or I'd like to be Josh Earnest. Josh Earnest was Obama's former press secretary, who is now VP of corporate communications for United Airlines, right? I just heard Josh yesterday on one of the news programs talking about the lottery that United is doing, giving away free tickets for vaccinated passengers.
I answered it.
The guy's on top of it.
Yeah.
And you have got to be on top of all those things. And so I know my daughter, who is a relatively newcomer to PR, she works for the On shoe company, in the On running shoe company in Portland. She's on top of it. I mean, she and I are texting each other back and forth on current events all the time. You know, so no, you cannot avoid it. You've got to be on top of it. You've got the traditional media, which is still important. You've got social media, which is still important. And we haven't even talked about crisis, brand. Well, we did talk about brand journalism, you know, media relations, all of these things. So being a PR person today means you've got to have a ton of tools, you know, that are accessible to you and that you're good at using. It's an amazing profession. Advertising, PR, marketing, integrated marketing, communication, social media, all of those things are coming together. It's really hard to pin PR down the way it used to be, right? And you know, that's probably a good thing. That's probably a good thing for students today, because there's so many ways they can sell themselves, right? I don't know where PR will be going, you know, 10 years from now. Will it have been fully digested into marketing and social media? I think there's always going to be a place for PR, because the CEO and the C-suite is always going to need wise counsel on everything from, can you imagine the CEO or CFO sitting in their office during the George Floyd crisis, probably having no idea really what's going on, and then being capable of making mistakes in their language, mistakes in the way they decide that they're not going to say anything to their employees. These are massive mistakes. What is the PR person's job? To try to keep them from making those mistakes, to say, look, ma'am, or look, sir, we have got to address this question. Our brand has to address this question. Can't you imagine, Shelley, the meetings that went on in Georgia with Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines after the original missteps they made on not even paying attention to the controversy over the Georgia voting rights issues? Somebody got to those CEOs and said, look, there's no way we can avoid this. We have, 20% of our employee population is African American, and you're going to ignore what's happening with the voting rights legislation in front of the Georgia state legislature? No, you have to take a stand on this. And of course they did. And what did that lead to? That led to a crisis on the other side. I mean, it is probably within the context of crisis communications, right? But most of that stuff you learn with experience. You learn with time. You learn as your gray hairs start popping up on your scalp, But crisis communication, of course, is probably one of the ways, and speech writing and messaging generally, speech writing, even though it seems like such an archaic term today, is really still massively important. You might not think of what you're doing as writing a speech, but in effect, if you are the person helping craft the words of the C-suite, you are also the person inevitably putting the ideas in the head of the CEO. If you're called upon to counsel the CEO, you are in effect writing that policy. It's still an enormously potent job to have. So imagine the pandemic without internal communicators. Oh my God, they were running the show. Many of these internal communicators who up until recently had been relegated to some cubicle in the basement were now the ones that were pulling all the switches. I mean, they were the ones saying, this is how we're going to communicate to our dispersed workforce. I mean, think about it. Hundreds and thousands and millions of employees were no longer in the office. Somebody had to determine, how are we going to keep our culture alive? How are we going to communicate our strategy and our messaging? And those were the internal communicators. So they just skyrocketed during this period. In fact, I would even say, if you're watching this, internal communications is a great field to go into. On the PR side, I would say the same thing. I think PR really did a wonderful job during the pandemic. Think of all the traps they could have stepped in. Think of all the minds. Because when I think of the pandemic year, I'm not just thinking about the pandemic. How do you disentangle the pandemic from Black Lives Matter, George Floyd? How many things can we take in a single year?